Start. Okay. So tell her to join the room and I'll promote her. Oh, there she is. Okay.
Oh, she's here. Okay, great. Hi, Jen. She made it.
We've got a PowerPoint.
Yes.
So do I just share my screen?
Yep. Probably, do you want to test it now before we start? Sort of a few minutes early.
Yeah.
Test it out. Oh my gosh, water.
We do have,
hang on.
I will say that we are open to the attendees right now, so don't do anything they don't want you to see. Other way around. But,
hello, everybody.
Hi, we're just testing our PowerPoint. Right, so I want to no, do I need permission to share my? Oh, here it is. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm having a time.
I was just checking to make sure you didn't. Okay, there we go. Good.
Okay, now please let me go into my presentation.
Perfect.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, we got everything we need.
Excellent. All right. So if you could just unshare your screen, we'll do the introductions and then you can share your screen again.
Fine.
All right.
I wrote, where's my notes? I wrote up a little introduction and hid it from myself, which is always a good idea.
Very logical.
I mean, that's what I tend to do as well.
You don't want it to be too easy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We've already got 33 people in here, so I'm just gonna kick us off.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I am the admin for this session, so I'm now going to give my standard admin speech, which you will hear multiple times today. I'm going to be helping with tech support and moderating the chat. This session is being recorded. I don't work for Zoom, but if you're having problems, mention it in the chat and I'll see what I can do. When the session starts, there will be a roughly 20-minute presentation followed by a roughly 20-minute Q&A, but whatever happens, we will be ending at 40 minutes sharp. If you have questions for the Q&A, you have two options. You can ask using voice chat by raising your hand and I'll let you speak, or you can text it in the chat window. Sorry, write it in the chat window and then I'll read them out. Keep the questions relatively family friendly. Any abusive behavior will result in removal from the session and a repeat performance will result in getting booted from the conference without a refund. With that, let me introduce our speakers and I will change my tab. Okay. American History Fangirls is a podcast that does not need an introduction from me, but let me try anyway. Jen and Jenny have been making podcasts since 2018, according to my phone, which makes them part of the OG vanguard of history podcasting. As the name implies, the show brings the listener various stories from the ancient world that the hosts are enthusiastic about telling. Bringing their enthusiasm into their research along with their unique podcasting style has made them beloved of their numerous fans, 43 of whom are here. With that, I'll turn this over to them.
Thank you so much.
I would just say, Jenny, I don't know that everyone saw your note. So we are talking about the cult of transgender Aphrodite. There will be some visible genitalia sometimes. So just an FYI, I mean, the visible genitalia is classical statues. So it's not something you wouldn't see in a museum. I haven't put anything in there.
It's not that graphic, but just if that matters to you.
Yeah.
Okay, so shall we start?
Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen so everyone can see the presentation. Okay.
All right, so I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And we're from Ancient History Fangirl. And Aphrodite was the Greek goddess of desire and sex and lust, the walking embodiment of sex and sexual pleasure. And most depictions of her, both ancient and modern, show her as a cisgender woman. And frequently a white woman. Why? Not always, but frequently.
Oh, why? She's from the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a tradition of depicting Aphrodite as a penis-having woman. Hang on, we went too far there. And possibly intersex within the context of the ancient mystery cults documented on the island of Cyprus.
When you dig into the ancient origins of Aphrodite, ancient Mesopotamian sky goddesses such as Inanna and Ishtar, gender nonconformity is part of these traditions. That gender nonconformity was de-emphasized in later classical Greek depictions, but it was preserved for a time in ancient mystery cults on Cyprus and elsewhere in classical Greece.
The goddess Aphrodite has her roots in the ancient Near Eastern goddess of love, known at different times as Astarte, Ishtar, and Inanna. She was worshipped in places including ancient Babylon, Assyria, and Sumeria, going back thousands of years.
Inanna, the ancient Sumerian goddess, is perhaps the oldest of all and the original Aphrodite ancestor. Her worship goes back as far as 4000 BC. And like Aphrodite, she was the goddess of love, sex, and beauty.
She was also a goddess of war, and this carries through in the mythology and worship of Aphrodite as well. Some cult centers worshipped Aphrodite as a goddess of war, especially in Sparta. And Aphrodite's link to Ares is believed to be a carryover from her former association with war in the Near East.
And Inanna was said to have the power to change a person's gender or sex, either or. We know about this from hymns written by a woman named Enheduanna, an Akkadian who lived from 2285 to 2250 BC. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the first ruler of the Akkadian Empire.
Sargon doted on his daughter Enheduanna, and when he conquered the Sumerians, he appointed her high priestess of the temple of Inanna in the city of with the mission to combine ancient Sumerian gods with the Akkadian gods and create a new combined pantheon that would make his empire more stable. And this is the trick that we see pulled all the time again in history, particularly with the Romans.
Enheduanna did this through writing, telling new stories that redefined the pantheon. She wrote many poems, prayers, and psalms to her goddess Inanna, and in one of them, translated as Passionate Inanna, she claims, to destroy, to create, to tear out, to establish are yours, Inanna. To turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man are yours, Inanna.
So from her earliest incarnations, this goddess had the ability to change people's gender. But that isn't all. From the very beginning, transgender women were heavily involved in Inanna's worship. Around the 3rd millennium BC, temple records started mentioning the priestesses of Inanna called the Gala.
The Gala's primary occupation was singing religious hymns and lamentations to Inanna, and these hymns were explicitly gendered. Traditionally, they were exclusively sung by women, cisgender women. Some historians speculate that this is because lamentations and funereal wailings were generally coded female in this culture, and these religious lamentations arose out of that tradition.
The ancient Sumerians had a whole dialect only used by women in their literature. This dialect was called Emensal, sorry, I'm a little dyslexic, translated as fine tongue or high-pitched voice. The hymns to Inanna were sung only in this dialect. The Gala were specialists in singing these very feminine coded songs, but the Gala were not primarily cisgender women. The picture that emerges seems to be this. People who had formerly lived as men, upon joining the cult of Inanna, took female names, wore women's clothing, and lived as women, and exclusively used the Sumerian dialect Emensal, reserved for women only, to sing their hymns.
Statues and carvings of Gala have been found in which the Gala look distinctly feminine, have breasts, and wear women's clothes. There may have been a ritual transformation from male to female involved in their induction into the religion. And as the hymns say that Inanna has the power to change men to women, that does make sense. We don't know for sure, but it's possible.
Another of Enheduanna's poems describes a religious procession for Inanna, in which women dressed in men's clothing on their right side and men dressed in women's clothing on their left side.
The people of Sumer parade before you. The male prostitutes comb their hair before you. They decorate the napes of their necks with colored scarves. The women adorn their right side with men's clothing. The men adorn their left side with women's clothing.
Inanna was called Ishtar by the Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, and their version of the goddess was even more explicitly gender nonconforming. And this may be because of her strong association with the planet Venus, which ancient Semitic religions saw as having two genders, female in the morning and male in the evening.
Ishtar, like Venus, the planet, not the Roman version of Aphrodite, had both female and male aspects. In fact, her male embodiment was a god named Attar, worshipped as a god of war. Some cults worshipped Attar, the male embodiment of a female goddess, as a woman, and others as a man. Some historians believe that this dual-natured gender of Ishtar's was because of her dual nature as a deity of love and war. In a hymn to Ishtar, Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, describes Ishtar thus, quote, "Like Ashur, she is bearded with a beard. She is clothed in splendor."
And what's interesting about Ishtar's more gender nonconforming depictions is that she is rarely seen as a cisgender man, more a woman with some male sexual characteristics. And even when she's depicted with male characteristics, the language used to refer to her in text is consistently feminine in the ancient Semitic language. Ishtar always has she, her pronouns.
The ancient Greeks mainstreamed the goddess Aphrodite primarily as a cisgender woman, but they left clues in her mythology about her transgender roots.
The ancient goddess Ishtar Inanna was adopted by the Phoenicians as Astarte and later brought to the early cult centers on Cyprus and Kithra by way of Ascalon, an ancient city in Syria. As the ancient Greeks adopted and adapted Aphrodite's worship, they made her conform to their own gendered expectations of a goddess of love. And that meant getting rid of her ancient associations with war and gender nonconformity.
Even though the classical Greeks mainly conceived of Aphrodite as cisgender, however, they left a clue in her mythology about her transgender roots. It's in Aphrodite's origin story. When Kronos sliced off Uranus's testicles and threw them into the sea, and Aphrodite arose from the foam that frothed up in the ocean around the detached bits.
So this is a quote from the queer classicist because we think she described it best. Quote, "Aphrodite is solely constructed from what the ancient Greeks perceived to be the defining male feature, and yet she's a woman. The most beautiful goddess who was born of a fully formed woman was at the same time considered to be biologically just 100% Uranus's dick."
That's true. This is one of the oldest myths about Aphrodite, appearing in Hesiod's Theogony around the 700s BC. There's another clue about Aphrodite's gender nonconforming nature and her powers in Herodotus's histories, which dates sometime between 426 and 415 BC. In the histories, Herodotus tells us the story of a group of Scythians who plundered a temple of Aphrodite in Ascalon in Syria.
This temple to Aphrodite was the most ancient in existence, according to Herodotus. And that's because the Phoenicians worshipped Aphrodite as Astarte in Ascalon long before they brought her to Cyprus and Kithra. This was a temple to Aphrodite that predated her worship in Greece.
And according to Herodotus, Aphrodite visited a special punishment on the Scythians who raided that temple. She struck them and all their descendants with what Herodotus calls the quote-unquote female sickness. What that means is that she turned them intersex or perhaps transgender. And one of the things that we have found in researching this topic is that the dividing line between transgender and intersex and gender nonconforming, other forms of being, non-binary or gender nonconforming, was kind of weak. Like they didn't have a lot of differentiation. So it was kind of sometimes hard to tell what we're talking about here. So intersex or transgender, probably.
So both of these stories tell us something important about Aphrodite, that her nature was gender nonconforming from her earliest Greek myths, and also that she had the power to change people's gender, just as Inanna did. And there were mystery cults in ancient Greece where Aphrodite was worshipped explicitly as a woman with a penis. So let's look into that worship.
Like Ishtar, Aphrodite had what is usually described as a male version of herself, named Aphroditos. Aphroditos was worshipped mainly on Cyprus, and our main evidence for her, we are using she, her pronouns for Aphroditos specifically for a reason, we'll get into it, comes in the form of herms, which were found on the island dating from the 4th century BC.
Perhaps the oldest evidence for Aphroditos is a terracotta plaque found in Pacoria on the mainland.
Paracora.
Paracora, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, on the mainland in the Peloponnese, depicting Aphroditos being born from severed male genitals. This dates from the 7th century BC. Some scholars believe that the myth in Hesiod about Aphrodite's origin story originates from older myths about the origin of Aphroditos.
Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of dual paradigm, because there is another myth about Aphrodite's origin, which says that she's the daughter of Zeus and I think a nymph named Dione. Is that right? Yeah. And so there is one theory that the story about Aphrodite being born from Zeus and Dione is the story of Aphrodite's birth. And the myth about the genitals is the story of Aphroditos' birth. That's one theory.
Yeah.
So like Ishtar's male counterpart, Aphroditos is generally not depicted as a cisgender man. She's depicted as a woman with curves and breasts in women's clothes and also a penis. And we are using she, her pronouns here because although she's often referred to as quote unquote male by people outside of the cult, obviously, we think that's a misgendering. We believe that the Aphrodite and Aphroditos pairing can be more accurately described, not as female and male, but as cisgender and transgender, both women. And that is our theory. I haven't seen a huge amount written on that. I have, not saying nobody has, but that is our theory.
Yeah. And we don't know how Aphroditos was worshipped, what her mythology really was, or what her worshippers believed, but we do have accounts from ancient writers who witnessed the rituals.
According to Macrobius, a Roman writer who lived in the 300s AD, Aphroditos was strongly associated with the moon, and he's an outsider in the cult. But he did see some of the rites performed, and here's how he describes the worship of Aphroditos. Quote, "There's also a statue of Venus, Aphroditos, Venus, on Cyprus that's bearded, shaped, and dressed like a woman with a scepter and male genitals, and they conceive her as both male and female. Aristophanes calls her Aphroditos, and Laelius says, worshipping then the nurturing god Venus, whether she is male or female, just as the moon is a nurturing goddess. In his Athes Pylochorus, too, states that she is the moon and that men sacrifice to her in women's dress, women in men's, because she is held to be both male and female." And what's really interesting about this quote is that it harkens back to the worship of Ishtar, the tie to Venus as, you know, the star that has both male and female aspects, and worshippers sacrificing to her or worshiping her in cross-gender dress.
Yeah. And Philostratus, who is another Roman writer, writing about 100 or to 150 or so years later, also
earlier,
also described the festival of Aphroditos and how her worshippers defied the gender binary. And this quote doesn't have the best language in it, just letting you know now. It's from a free open source as we weren't able to translate it ourselves. Quote, "The torches give a faint light, enough for the revelers to see what is close in front of them, but not enough for us to see them. Peals of laughter rise and women rush along with men, wearing men's sandals and garments girt in strange fashion. For the revel permits women to masquerade as men and men to put on women's garb and ape the walk of women."
This is not the best language, but
not the best language.
One thing we see happening with Aphrodite is that the ancient Greeks took aspects of her that didn't fit their concept of a love goddess and put them one step removed. So those qualities now were embodied in someone Aphrodite was close to rather than in the goddess herself.
Yeah, and they did this with Aphrodite's ancient association with war. While Ishtar and Inanna were fierce war goddesses, Aphrodite's connection to war is mostly preserved through her relationship with Ares.
And they did it with Aphrodite's gender non-conforming aspects as well. While goddesses like Ishtar and Inanna had female and male aspects, transgender priestesses, and a long tradition of gender-bending worship, eventually the ancient Greeks took that part of Aphrodite and put it at one remove by giving her an intersex child.
This child is mentioned briefly in an ancient Greek source, the philosopher Theophrastus, writing around the 200 BC, but their story didn't really appear in detail until Diodorus Siculus, writing between 60 and 30 BC, put it in his Library of History.
The mythology goes like this. Aphrodite had a child with Hermes, and that child's name was a combination of their two names. Hermes plus Aphrodite equals Hermaphroditos.
According to the mythology, Hermaphroditos was originally a cisgender boy. He swam in a spring inhabited by the nymph Salmachus, who fell violently in love with him. She assaulted him, which is not okay, and the gods combined their bodies together so that Hermaphroditos had both female and male sex characteristics.
Interestingly, we've also seen another non-mythological origin proposed for that name, Aphroditos plus Hermi, meaning a herm of Aphroditos. Hermi, or herms, were square statues in ancient Greece with a head at the top and a dick somewhere in the middle.
Very odd.
That's what they were.
Yeah, they were boundary markers. Yeah.
I love them.
Originally, they were signposts and boundary markers, and many of the statues of Aphroditos that have survived were herms.
And this is a picture of one of them right here. This suggests that the story of the intersex child of Aphrodite may have been inspired by earlier herm statues of Aphroditos, the transgender Aphrodite. And this does make sense because statues and other depictions of Aphroditos predate the mythology of Hermaphroditos by several centuries.
The thing about mystery cults is that they're mysterious, right? People involved in these cults did not share their beliefs or their sacred texts and inscriptions. Often, they were just as mysterious to people in their time as they are to us today. This is as true of the cult of Aphroditos as of other cults.
The ancient Romans and Greeks would sometimes make up their own mythology to explain the things they saw people doing in mysterious cults that they didn't understand. So these are outsider myths. This mythology may have had little to do with what the worshippers in these cults actually did believe.
Here we go. Was the myth of Hermaphroditos created, at least in part, to explain the mystery cult of let me just start again. Sorry about that. Was the myth of Hermaphroditos created, at least in part, to explain the mystery cult of Aphroditos and the herms and statues of her that could be found in ancient Cyprus? Possibly. It's also possible that the origin story of Aphrodite was an appropriation of older myths about Aphroditos. We'll never know for sure.
What we do know is that Aphrodite has always been gender nonconforming. From her deepest roots as Ishtar and Inanna, transgender women led her worship. And in some of her oldest cult sites, she was quite possibly worshipped as a transgender woman herself.
Yeah, it doesn't have to change how you see Aphrodite. She is, as she's always been, the goddess of love, of beauty, of lust and sex and sexual agency, Our Lady of the Castration bone, the walking embodiment of orgasm herself. And she just so happens to be trans. So we've got some time for questions.
The end, unless there are questions.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I think this was the shortest, well, this is the one with the most time for questions that we've ever actually done. I seem to remember this going straight up to the end a couple times.
Yeah.
So we've got one question right up front from Robert Ross.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if the love that Aphrodite was god of meant the romantic love as often depicted now, or of attraction, lust, and appeal?
That's actually a really complex question.
Yeah.
I think it depends on what embodiment of Aphrodite you're talking about, because this changed depending on the time period in history. Like the 18th century, gentlemen scholars had different opinions on that than people in the 17th century, people in the classical world. There were aspects of Aphrodite that represented platonic love, and there was definitely a whole, different aspects of Aphrodite that represented homosexual versus heterosexual love. Sometimes the Romans appropriated her to represent the love of the marriage bed, which I think is a pretty big pivot for Aphrodite.
That's a huge pivot for Aphrodite.
Yeah, because
Aphrodite also had quite a lot of see them as sort of like little cherubs, like you see Eros. He wasn't the only one. She had other aspects who would go out and sort of.
Hermaphroditos was one.
Hermaphroditos was
I
one.
think they represented marriage, love, like the love of marriage,
Yeah.
because they had male and female aspects.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
like she was, I kind of think like it's just such a difficult question, and some of it depends on the time period. Some of it like just depends. I mean, she was just kind of the overall goddess of what we think of as love, lust, sex, orgasm, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Mm.
Elspeth asked, this is fascinating stuff. How did you first encounter this topic? And Roberto asked a similar question, so I'm just going to collapse on one.
Fine.
It was actually great because I was doing a whole series on sex workers, and I came across the fact that Aphrodite was considered the patron goddess of sex workers. So I wanted to do an episode in the podcast about the cult of Aphrodite and how she was worshipped within that community. And I wound up, Jen decided that this had not enough mythology on it, so she was going to take it and run with it. There's never enough mythology for Jen. No. So she did a whole episode on Aphrodite's mythology, and while we were both doing that research, I came upon, was it Bettany Hughes?
It's Bettany Hughes. Bettany Hughes is Venus and Aphrodite.
It was Bettany Hughes' book, Venus and Aphrodite, where she mentioned transgender Aphrodite and gave some of these facts. And I was just, my mind was blown. I was like, is Aphrodite been trans the whole time? I have to tell everybody about it. So I just got really passionate about it, did a whole episode about it, and learned more about the presence of transgender women and men and nonconforming people, gender nonconforming people in the ancient world, and about how their stories are just kind of untold in a lot of mainstream history. So we wound up doing a whole series on the podcast called Gender Rebels, which is about intersex, transgender, queer, gender nonconforming people in both history and mythology in ancient Greece and Rome, which was a very, very rigid patriarchy with very rigid ideas of the gender binary. So yeah, so that's how it got started.
Yeah, and then, because there's never enough mythology, we're just at the end of that series. We've looked into gender rebels of Greek and Roman mythology, and we've been able to really dig into the stories that the ancient Greeks and Romans told themselves, and how that worked, and how that mythology really enforced the gender binary or shattered it.
So along a similar vein, Greta asked, have you seen anything about the Zeus plus nymph being a way for the Greeks to absorb Aphrodite, which seems like a similar kind of way to...
Possibly. What do you think?
Possibly. I haven't done a deep dive into that aspect, so I wouldn't want to comment too much. I would have to do a bit of a bigger dive. It's an interesting theory. I don't know. It's a good question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because she would have had to have been absorbed from somewhere else in general.
She would have, either she's the oldest goddess, like it's very much the same situation you have with Dionysus, right? Either Dionysus is this very, very ancient god, or he's the youngest god in the pantheon. And when you look at the way his mythology comes down to us, some of that is because of Dionysus, much like we're looking at here, transgender Aphrodite, or Aphrodite has a lot of things about him that didn't work with the Greek patriarchy, right? He's very gender nonconforming. He has he lived sometimes as a woman when he was a child, and sometimes as a man, and sometimes he's got a beard, and sometimes he's a young boy. Maybe he came from the Far East, maybe he didn't. Like, it's the same thing. And I think part of it is because of the cultural exchange that you're seeing. These different gods and goddesses are sort of blending together, and the stuff that is less in their rigid binary is maybe more difficult for them to explain. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Another great follow-on to that, J.E. Moon asked, the relationship to the moon, any relationship to Artemis, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but Dianic cults that involved castrated men.
Oh, do you mean like Artemis at Ephesus with all the boobs? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen a connection, but there could well be one. I don't know. There were different ways that the ancients conceived of the moon, and to be honest, I don't know enough about Artemis at Ephesus and her or their mythology and how that goddess was worshipped to be able to tell. But I'd be really interested in learning more about that.
Aiden said, Norse mythology has two gods of fertility, the male Frey and the female Freya. Could this be inspired by trans Aphrodite?
Really good question. Well, if you think about it, Norse mythology goes back to Germanic mythology, and there was a lot of cultural exchange between the Germanic culture and people and the Romans. And there has been documented stuff that it is either, you can see that in, for example, examples of like triplicate goddesses that appear in various places, like the Romans have, or the ancient Greeks really, like they have the Fates, and you know, the Norse have the Norns and all that stuff. Like, and there's, you know, of course, Celtic and Gallic examples of this too. So I would say my sense of things is maybe, but I have no proof of it.
Yeah.
It's always fun as professional historians, as non-professional historians.
I was gonna say, wait a minute.
I'm like, who among us are professional historians? Not me.
Not us.
Can you comment on a related, oh, sorry, this is Preston Palmer, but it's not staying open. Preston Palmer, okay, yeah. Can you comment on a related situation where Ishtar and other Mesopotamian deities usually swapped genders in southern Arabia, where Ishtar becomes the male war god, Astar, and most other gods of Mesopotamian origin were worshipped under a different gender, or more generally, how other deities change genders in different contexts? That was a lot.
That's a big question.
It's a big question. I mean,
I would say, I mean, there was always a gender non-conforming aspect to Ishtar and Inanna, and I think that had to do with the fact of, you know, love being seen as a feminine realm and war being seen as a male realm, but they're putting this in one deity. And also the deities are kind of, in a lot of cultures, not just in these cultures, the deities are seen as kind of beyond gender. Like being able to transcend your gender was a quality of being God that is not limited to ancient Mesopotamian gods, for sure, or, you know, more modern or more recent deities.
Yeah. Okay. Kevin Woodruff said, hetero non-normativity seems an old phenomenon among gods and women and man. Do you have any thoughts on how and why, in particular, Aphrodite et al. Were conceived as what we call trans? Thanks. It seems like that's more or less what you were just talking about.
I think that's just our presentation.
Yeah.
I think we just gave a presentation on that. Do you have any thoughts beyond that, Jen?
No.
Graham Rule said, while I understand your decision to use she, her pronouns, I was wondering about some of the translated sources you used. Did they do the same? In particular, the she and os masculine noun is surprising.
Actually,
Yeah.
You want to go or do you want me to go?
You can go on that. I have thoughts too. Go ahead. You start.
We both have thoughts. Okay. Yeah, I was the one who did the original research on it, and it was a conscious decision that I made sometimes to use different pronouns than were used in the traditional sources, and this is one of them. Aphroditos is usually represented with he, him pronouns. But looking at Aphroditos, to me, I thought, well, I think that is a misgendering, just based on, you know, the history and the way that she was presented and the way that people can see. It's very clear that the Greeks were, if they wanted to make a statue of a cisgender man, they could have done that.
Yeah, I mean,
they have done it before.
Do we lose you, Jenny?
Yeah, a little bit.
Very deliberately making a choice. It was important to choice. Sorry, what am I missing something?
Yeah, you cut out about 30 seconds ago.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so anyway, so what I was saying was I made conscious choices sometimes to depart from the way that some characters in this whole Gender Rebel series were represented in the ancient sources and in the translations. Aphroditos, as you noticed, has the os at the end of the name, and she's normally described as a he, him character, like he, him pronouns. I did not come across any other translation or historical context where she, her pronouns were used for Aphroditos. That was a conscious choice that I made on my part, because my point is that Aphroditos is probably supposed to be a trans woman and not a cisgender man. I mean, you could, or possibly an intersex person. I could have used they, them pronouns too, and I think that would have been maybe more accurate to the spirit of Aphroditos as well. Bearing in mind that I'm not a professional historian, this is just my take on things. This is a lens that I applied. It was a conscious choice on my part.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
Elspeth just has a really great comment. right? Because gender nonconformity is way scarier and weirder than Zeus boinking women while a bull or a swan.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, come on.
Good question. Jen, did you have other thoughts about pronouns and Aphroditos?
right.
Because I remember you saying you did.
No, I think like it is important. Yes, the os is generally masculine. However, some names would be, we've seen it a few different times, would be gender neutral. I don't know if this is the case, you know?
Yeah.
I'm just going to say, I see the comment about not king shaming. We are not king shaming, but I would say a lot of his encounters were non-consensual.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's more of the part that, you know.
Exactly.
I mean, bestiality can never really be said to be consensual because animals can't really consent.
Okay,
you know what? I'm not going down that road. No. Rein it back. Rein it back.
Zoe or Zoe, I'm not sure, asked, do we see any other gods who are similarly gender non-conforming as Aphrodite, but more on the trans man side of things?
Actually, that's a really good question.
That's a really good question. Do you want to start, Jenny?
Well, it's a big question. I can't think of deities off the top of my head. Jen, I'm sure you might have some in mind, but I'm thinking of, for example, the character of Tiresias, who can be seen as either a trans woman or a trans man, depending on the angle of approach that you're taking. There is Caenus, who is one of the Argonauts, who was born, you know, assigned female at birth and was changed by Poseidon into a man. What's that?
Iphis.
Oh yeah, Iphis and Ianthe, of course. Iphis and this is from Ovid. And this is a mythological, or you know, it's a retelling. But Iphis and Ianthe is the story of you know, a person raised or born with female assigned genitals, raised as a boy, who falls in love with another girl, and who bemoans the fate that she has, because she's in love with this girl and she's about to marry her, she's going to marry her, or he, you know, actually probably should, him pronouns probably more appropriate. He wants to marry her, but he does not have male assigned genitals, and he's very worried about what she's going to think when she finds out, and is this going to just blow up their marriage? And at the last minute, Iphis is praised really, really hard, and I think it's is it Isis who
Isis and Aphrodite, I think, was involved as well.
No, I think it was the goddess Aphrodite. I think it was the goddess Isis specifically, I think, gifted male genitals to Iphis. And that is actually, we use that as kind of the linchpin story in our Gender Rebel series, because if there are elements to the Iphis and Ianthe story that apply very clearly to transgender people in the ancient world, to queer women in the ancient world, just based on Iphis's experience of, like, you know, not understanding how a female-bodied woman can love another woman, and how that experience was quite erased in classical Greece. Also intersex people, because there are all these stories about, these are more medicalized and less mythologized, but there are all these stories about people being born assigned female and sprouting genitals or growing genitals, you know, around when they hit puberty, and or mostly the way it's depicted is when they get married, and which would have realistically in this time period been around puberty. So it's always kind of associated with marriage, this sort of genital change. Sometimes it's depicted in the sources as mythological, and a god is, you know, granting genitals to this person. And sometimes it's kind of described as this medical thing that happens, like this medical transformation. And historians, I've read that, you know, historians commenting on these stories, then describing them as transitioning stories. And there are also examples of people in both mythologized and, I would say, you know, pseudo-historical sources, like, for example, Phlegon of Tralles, who talks about men, quote unquote, well, like, you know, like men, or actually, yeah, I'm talking about trans men. So men giving birth. So you would think that that is possibly small, but, you know, believable evidence of trans men existing in this world. So
I would say just non-conforming in general, Dionysus.
Always
I could go on
Dionysus.
about Dionysus forever.
I think that was the subject of our last presentation last year.
Yeah, it was.
Or the year before. Did we skip? I think we skipped last year.
Yeah, 2020. Yeah, I think we skipped last year.
Through a complete oversight on my part, I have to say, I got like to the month or the week or two before last year, and I was like, I didn't invent Jen and Jenny. What's wrong with
It's okay.
At that point, the slots were full.
It happens. There's lots of other people who, you know, deserve the spot as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
J.E. Moon said, that's, and I should say, this is the last question because we're almost out of time. That's another question I had. Isis is related to Aphrodite's antecedents. Does she have any of the same transgender magic outside of that one story?
Interesting question. I didn't come across it. I'm not saying she doesn't, though.
Yeah, and we haven't dug deep enough into Egyptian mythology to really give you a really qualified answer on it. So I wouldn't want to do that, but maybe.
I would also say that I'm not saying that Isis isn't related to characters like Inanna and Astarte, but I wouldn't say there's a direct corollary. I think that sometimes in popular culture, she's depicted as like the goddess of love in Egypt. That's not necessarily, I mean, she had affinities to motherhood, she had affinities to sorcery, she had affinities to magic and healing. I wouldn't say she was like I could be wrong on this. I haven't done a huge deep dive on Isis, but I don't know that she was necessarily a love goddess or a love and sex and war goddess in the way that Astarte and Inanna and Ishtar were.
I would say across the ancient Mediterranean, she's a very important goddess to.
Well, yeah.
Absolutely, like every culture has her in some way, not necessarily directly related to Aphrodite or someone else. Like a lot of them had their own cults that just worshipped her.
And as for age, I can't really speak to which one came first, but they were all, you know, the early evidence for all of these is around the same time-ish. I think.
This is where we need Dominic and
I'm very, very knowledgeable on Isis. I did the entry for Isis in our book, but it was unfortunately not as in depth as an episode I would do.
Yeah, but we'll get there one day.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we've got less than a minute left, so I'm just going to say we'll cut it there because that's a good breaking point. And thank you, Jen and Jenny, both for a wonderful presentation on something I had never heard of, and that was I knew I was in for a good time when I saw the title, and I think everyone else here did too. So, and thanks everybody for coming, and I'll let you all go on to your next sessions now.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Of course.